Okay, well, thank you for being here. I'm Jana Sundin. I'm the Canon for Children and Youth. Hello. And so I'm the Canon for Children and Youth, and that includes young adults and campus ministry. That was just too long for one person's title, so it's kind of in quiet parentheses. And my role is to support formation with all of these age groups throughout the diocese, and so I do that by visiting churches and consultations and directing summer camps and other diocesan activities and family camps also. I just finished seminary in May, and thank you. And I wrote a thesis for that, which is very all-consuming, and I know you know that. Hold on.
I know, but I really want you to take your mask off while you're talking to us when you're far enough away from all of us, and then we can all understand what you're saying, and what you're saying is fabulous.
Okay.
It's a lot of pressure.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
I will do that for you. So I wrote a thesis, and so I'm going to talk about it a little bit because it was very all-consuming for at least 8 to 10 months of my life. And I think it's really interesting and relevant to what we're going to be talking about. And if you're interested, the title of it is Secure Relationship, Playful Worship, The Gifts of Childhood and Disability in a Worshiping Community. I still have to read it because it's a long title. So let's see. Let's begin with an acknowledgement of the land that we're on and the native people on whose ancestral homelands we gather, the Pima Maricopa in this place, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their home here today. So this is what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to just start with what is evangelism? What is this whole thing that we're talking about this weekend? And then we're going to talk about evangelism with young people in your church, by young people in your church, and to young people outside of your church. And then we'll end with some resources and ideas and strategies sharing. So I'd like to hear, how do you define evangelism? And maybe you got some really good definitions from the first workshop that you went to. Mary Jane. Spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. Yeah. What else? What else comes to mind with that term? Allison.
Sharing your story about how your faith is important to you, as well as listening to others about what they are looking for in their own faith.
Yes. That is, can you just say that again?
Sharing your faith and what your faith means to you, your story, and listening to others about what is important about their faith to them.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
I would like to change one word on that. When she says faith, I think that word should be changed to story.
Story. Well, she used both words.
Share your story. You don't even have to mention Jesus to start with. Sharing the story of what you do and how you do it, actions. Evangelism is actions. It's not necessarily taking the Bible and beating people on the head with it.
Yeah.
It's sharing your story and asking them what is yours.
I would say it's definitely not taking a Bible and beating people on the head with it. Yeah. So sharing your story, which involves, hopefully for all of us, our faith. And using the language of faith is a totally good thing to do. We just have to learn how to do it in a way that doesn't feel like we're hitting people over the head with something. Yeah. I think of it as, there are a few different things that I think of for evangelism, and one is sharing God's mission of reconciling love with the whole world. Because it's not just about how Jesus and I, in our personal relationship, are really good and happy. It's that what we see here, the hard things that we come across and and are witnessing in the world, that's not the whole story, and it's not the end. And God wants for all things to be reconciled in goodness and love, and I think that's really good news. Evangelism is invitational rather than kind of an older colonial model or coercive model. So does anybody have anything to add?
Spreading the good news where you are, places you go.
Yeah, spreading good news where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't necessarily need to go somewhere else to do it, because we all have interactions in the lives that we have as they are right now. Yeah, thanks, Joe. So this is the definition from the Office of Evangelism for the Episcopal Church. So Allison, you kind of paraphrased this. We seek, name, and celebrate Jesus' loving presence in the stories of all people, then invite everyone to more. And I assume that we'll hear more about this from the presiding bishop in just a little bit. In a little bit in here, we're going to do an exercise where we're going to practice sharing our stories with each other. So introverts, just prepare yourselves.
Oh, now they're all going to walk. Now you told them.
So why do we want to do evangelism with young people? And before anybody offers answers to that question, I'm going to strike down preemptively a few things that I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear that children and youth are the future of the church, because they're already in the church. They're full members by virtue of their baptism and their presence in our communities. So they're not the future of the church, except in as much as they will move into the future of the church. We need to keep the church alive. How are we going to keep our doors open if we don't have more young people coming in? If kids want to come to church, then they'll bring their parents too. So these are all things that I hear, and they're said by very well-meaning, they come from a good place, and because we love church, and we want to see the church thrive and survive and go beyond us. But no population or demographic should ever be seen or used as a marketing tool for the church. And if we're ministering to specific people because we want to further the stability of the church, they'll know it, because it's not coming from a place of evangelism, of sharing good news. It's coming from a place of self-preservation, which is not good news. So with that said, what are your reasons for why we should practice evangelism with young people? Yeah, James.
Children and teenagers have better bullshit detectors than adults.
Yes, they do. I'm not going to repeat that for the recording just because.
So if you're sharing something good with a young person and it's real, then they're gonna respond to it. They're gonna give something back to you. And if you aren't doing that, they're gonna know it.
Yeah, right.
And then the other side of that is listening to them,
Yes.
which is different than just hearing. Listening is
Yeah.
hearing and comprehending.
Mm-hmm.
And they may not need any feedback other than you listening.
Right.
Too many of them say nobody pays any attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Cassandra.
It's confusing to be a young person. And the gospel has something to offer to people who are in the confusing stage of being young.
Yes. I'm going to say that for the recording. It's confusing being a young person, and the gospel has something to offer to people who are living in this state of confusion. Yeah, thank you. We also promise to do it at any baptism that we're part of. We make promises that we will do everything in our power to support these persons in their life in faith. We promise that we will proclaim by word and example the good news of God and Christ. So we already said we would do it, so that's one reason to do it. And part of, James pointed out one of the gifts of kids, and another is that they bring a different lens, a different kind of set of awarenesses to the church and to the world that those of us who are older just might not be aware of. And it's not because we're doing something wrong, it's just because we're looking at the world from a different vantage point. And so if we're not exposing ourselves to what they bring, then we're incomplete. There's something that we're missing, and it's important. So how does the good news show up in young people?
Expand that a little bit. How does the good news show up in your?
Yeah, so we're talking about why do we want to practice evangelism with young people? And so kind of building on that idea that they bring gifts into our midst. What are some of those gifts that we notice? What are some of the ways that the good news of Jesus Christ is present to us in the lives of young people? Yeah, Mary Jane.
The way they help others.
They help others. Sometimes they're really they love to get up and do something helpful. Yeah. Allison.
They have an innate sense of curiosity and innocence.
There's an innate curiosity, yeah, and innocence sometimes. But there is there's less guile than there is as people get older. Yeah. Yes.
I think our teenagers and our young adults have a much more defined sense of justice than the older people in church. And
Yeah.
much more willing to go out and take on the activism and
Mhm.
not just claim, love all, but actually show.
Yeah.
There's a fire.
There's a fire in them, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that we could, the church would benefit from that.
Yeah. The church can benefit from their kind of prophetic voice. Yeah.
So what the person over there said about confusing,
Mm-hmm.
and I think confusing is a positive spiritual state that many people who get past 21 give up
Mm.
for comfortable delusion.
Mm.
And so I would rather be confused than live in my comfortable delusions.
Mm.
And so I think children and young adults and teens bring us that desire to figure out what's real
Mm-hmm.
and what's real about God and us.
Mhm.
And so it gives back something to the rest of the body of Christ that it can lose so easily without.
Yeah. And we're going to talk in a little bit about the discomfort that can result from being a community that really works alongside young people. Did somebody over here? No. Okay. So then, talking about the good news, we've touched on this a little bit, but in order to evangelize, it helps to be able to articulate what the good news is. And I've heard, in the first workshop I was in, I heard a couple people say, we don't even need to say the name Jesus to evangelize. But, it's kind of an important word. So I would like to hear from you. What are some ways that you articulate what is the good news? Yes.
My example is that you don't have to start using Jesus. To me, evangelism is action. And as was mentioned before, the kids can figure out what the BS is.
Mm-hmm.
Just by your action alone, and what you say you're going to do, and if you do it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing is, as far as I'm concerned, you need to get the foot in the door so that you are proved to be trustworthy.
Mm.
And then you step on from there. And then you ask them, or you can ask them at the beginning, what do you think? Where are your thoughts?
Yeah. So if it's all talk and no action, then that may not actually be evangelism. But talking about what is the good news? What's the good news? Cassandra, you said there's good news for people who are, I'm not saying you have to answer, but I know you can. So tell us, what would you say is the good news?
I think I would start with the prologue to John's Gospel, that we live in a world of darkness, but that it doesn't have to be darkness. There is light that can shine into it. And so we're broken, the world is broken. It all seems very depressing, but it doesn't have to be depressing because there's a light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it.
Yeah. That's pretty compelling. Yeah.
How about that, that they're never alone, or that we are never alone?
Yeah, that we're never alone. That's huge. Yeah.
Just to build off of that, yeah, there's, I think for a lot of young people these days, there's a lot of isolation and a lot of faction. And the body of Christ is very much about being together and being welcoming. And unfortunately, that doesn't get shown a lot of the time. But it needs to be. Because that's, at least for me personally, that's one of the things I love the most about the church, about the Episcopal Church in particular, is that sense of belonging.
There's
that welcomeness of difference.
There's a sense of belonging, even if we're not all the same. And because of that, we're not alone, both because of the community that we belong to and also because Jesus is present everywhere with us. Yeah, Allison.
The good news is that we are loved.
We are loved. I wonder how many people go through their days without really hearing that or knowing it. And that's really, it's transformative if you're really able to take it in.
Well, and we are loved as we are. We don't have
Now,
like
yeah.
relationships. You don't have to conform. You don't have to change. You are loved as you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Such good stuff. And there's a podcast that I listen to sometimes. It's called the Christian History Almanac. And it's like interesting, you know, it's 10 minutes or less. And on this day in Christian history, here's a thing that happened. And here's a scripture passage. It's worth listening to. But I listen to it sometimes because the way they end is by saying this. And remember that the rumors of grace, forgiveness, and the redemption of all things are true. Everything is going to be okay. That's good news. And another part of good news is that it's not up to us to make it all happen. So whatever programs or strategies are employed in our churches, it's not about us making this work on our own power. It's about our response to God's good news in our lives and in our community. And God's good news animates our actions toward those with whom we want to share the good news. So there's freedom and joy in that approach to evangelism rather than anxiety or stress about like, are we going to get enough kids? Or, you know, is this going to happen or is that going to happen? Instead of we're thinking, if we have one person show up, we get to share this amazing news that they're loved, that they belong, that everything's going to be okay, that there's light in the darkness. So, with that said, let's talk a little bit about what it looks like to practice evangelism with young people. So, priest and liturgical scholar Ruth Myers, and professor to some of us in this room, she talks about mission and public worship as two components on a Mobius strip. And if you're familiar with a Mobius strip, it has only one side. It's one continuous side, and that are inseparable. And so worship and mission are always both inward-facing and outward-facing. So we're formed in Christian community and we're transformed through worship, and then we go out to live in the world as transformed people and then bring the world back into the church. So evangelism is happening inside out and outside in all the time. as people are formed in worship and take God's reconciling love out with them and invite others back with them into a life with Jesus. And so for that reason, I believe that evangelism starts with how we are together in church. So I've done quite a bit of reading and thinking. I read and think about this a lot. What it looks like to shift from a program-based model of formation and discipleship to a relationship and worship-based model. We can teach kids lots of important things to know in Sunday school, and it's good for them to know those things. But if there's no sense of connectedness or relationship in these really well thought out and planned, fun lessons that we do, the research is pretty clear that whatever happens is not going to last. It's not going to have long-term effects. And so with a missional worship model, we are being formed together, all generations in one place. And in order to be formed in that way, we need to be in relationship. So what can those relationships look like? So if you're not familiar, and if you can't see it on YouTube, it's a meme with Steve Buscemi going undercover as a high school student. And it's saying, "How do you do, fellow kids?" So I'm going to say first that if there hasn't been much intergenerational interaction in your church, it might feel daunting for members of one generation to consider intentionally interacting with members of other generations. And there are some people that some things that might help to know to make them more comfortable. So first, it's not necessary to pretend to be different than you are, or to be someone else. In fact, don't do that. It is necessary to be open-hearted and kind, to be curious about who people are. And it can help to know a little bit about different ages and stages and what's happening with kids who are in early elementary school and kids in later elementary school and high school and adolescence. And there are resources that I will share at the end that helps give that information. And it's really helpful to know what is important to young people. And some of those have been named already, but about the things that they want to be activists towards. And we'll talk about that again in a little while, but some of the justice issues that are very, very important and front and center for, I would say, most young people in your churches or around your churches. Safeguarding, of course, is also key. If we're talking about intergenerational relationships in your church, it's really critical that everyone understands the policies of safeguarding God's children and is willing to abide by them. And I personally think every adult in a church should complete the safeguarding training. So you can push for that in your vestries and bishops' committees and staff meetings. I'm going to talk a little bit about intergenerational friendship. In some of my research I did some case studies for my thesis, and I talked with a couple churches that have just people told stories of children who are sitting with, would be sitting during coffee hour or before church, just visiting with, a person who's 50 years older than they are, and they're not related. They just are enjoying having a conversation with each other. And I think that that's really beautiful. There's also this book, Love First, a children's ministry for the whole church. Again, this is on a list. I'm going to tell you where you can find it later. The author gives examples of, instead of asking someone to teach Sunday school for the rest of their life, she kind of discerned, what are the gifts that people want to share with these children? And so she writes, a retired speech therapist wanted to teach the youngest children a song in sign language. An avid gardener wanted to plant flowers on Earth Day. A crafter wanted to prepare art projects on a weekday morning. And some wanted to sit with wiggly kids during a messy project. So there are ways to use the creativity and interests that already exist in the congregation without asking people to commit the rest of their lives. Some other ideas, there are matchups between teenagers and seniors, adopt a grandparent, that kind of thing. Prayer partners. However you do it, there's lots of research that shows that teenagers have better outcomes academically, socially, emotionally, and spiritually when they have relationships with caring, non-family adults. And what better place for these relationships to take place than in a worshiping community? So having relationships requires time together and time getting to know each other and learning to tell our stories and learning to draw stories out of each other. So we are going to do a short exercise. And I would love for you to pair up with someone you don't know well. So you're going to have to move, which is fine because you're all sitting and you've been sitting for a long time. And this will help you stay awake. But give me just a second. Sorry, I'm not great at giving instructions. So in just a moment, I'm going to tell you to get up and find a partner who you do not already know well. And there will be a list of questions, and they're just kind of conversation starters. And your goal is just to have a conversation with someone you don't know, which I find awkward often. But it's important if we want to build relationships. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes. So you each have about 2.5 minutes. I'll give you a 2.5-minute warning so you know when to switch. You don't have to get through all the questions. And these questions are from an organization called Peer Ministry. And that's going to be on the list that I'm going to give you also. But it's just this nice acronym. So where are you from? Where else have you called home? What do you like about your neighborhood or where you live? If I considered moving there, what would you tell me? Things about where you're from. Hobbies and interests, that's pretty self-explanatory. Experiences and events. So what's a favorite life experience? What life event has shaped you or defines who you are? What's something at your church or school or family that has challenged you or that has been significant or meaningful? Acquaintances. Do you know so-and-so? Or who is a person you think I would want to know? Those kinds of things. And then travel. What's a favorite place you'd like to go or you have been? Any adventures, any travel mishaps, things like that. So, you may rise and find a partner, and I will tell you when it's been 2.5 minutes. To pray. God bless people with loud voices. Thank you. So, and thank you all for engaging in that exercise. What was that like for you? It's loud. It's a loud room. Yeah. Somebody over here had something to say. fun. It's fun to talk to people. You needed more time. Yeah, this was just a little taste. Yeah. Can you imagine just like intentionally having these kinds of conversations at church with people you don't know? People from different generations even? Yeah. What about fostering this kind of conversation? Because everybody here is in some kind of leadership in your church, has some kind of investment in how things go in your church. Otherwise, you wouldn't be at a diocesan convention. So can you imagine fostering this kind of conversation between other people in your church?
May I answer that?
Yeah,
Actually, I can.
wonderful.
You know, that's sort of part of my DNA, to such an extent that some people are really put off by it. But I really am interested in their story, who they are. I really want to know.
Yeah.
So I engage people in conversation and sometimes perhaps ask too many questions. But I
Oh,
care.
yeah. So that's a good point, that when we're asking people questions, we do want to be respectful of, you know, that they don't have to answer, right? And maybe when we're just first getting to know people, stay more on, you know, kind of open-ended but lighter subject matter, because then as a relationship grows, more sharing may happen. So a little bit more about evangelism with young people in your church. Now that we've practiced this relationship building skill, a couple more questions. Do we know the names of the people who we worship with? And if we don't, Helen, you do. Yeah. This is something that we might not talk about very often, but do we recognize how each person is part of making the liturgy happen when we gather? And that it was different because they were there than it would be if they had not been, and it would have been incomplete without them. So this question about did it matter that I was there comes from a conversation, several conversations with a group that I meet with from around the country fairly regularly to talk about intergenerational ministry. Life is really hard right now, and figuring out how to do church is hard right now, and it needs to matter, and it needs to feel to the people who are present and participating like they matter, like it matters that they were there, and that's necessary for it to be compelling enough to be there and to lead us together into evangelism. And also, I mentioned a little bit earlier, just awareness of things that young people care about. And we have some people in this room who are younger than I am, so you can add to my list if you want to. And these are things that a lot of you care about, but I will say that the younger the generation, the more truly existential and weighty these issues really are for people who will be living in the world that we're in for longer than the rest of us who are older will be. So climate change is huge. Gender identity is a big learning curve for a lot of people in the church right now, but is super important. And young people are very tuned into the changing ways that we use language to understand who people are and how they want to be genuinely in the world. Different ways of being, whether it's related to gender, sexual identity, or different kinds of abilities or special needs. Living wages and labor practices. So things have changed a lot in the last several decades, and so there are people who have nice pensions or were able to work a job for 40 years and retire comfortably, and that's not the reality that many of our, teenagers and 20s and 30s and 40-year-old people are facing. And so when you hear about wage inequity and wanting to raise, minimum wages, things like that, which can be pretty divisive issues, it's important to listen to the younger people, like, why is this important? And the preservation and defense of democracy. So these are some issues that are really important to young people right now. Are there others that are coming to mind? Student loans, student loan debt. Yes, that's huge. Okay.
Is there a way to get that list that you just read off about the things that matter? Will you remind me afterwards, and I'll just add it to the resource list? Okay.
Thanks, Scott. So the next statement on here is from that site that I mentioned, Peer Ministry. Youth are either leading or they are leaving, and that's kind of one of their catchphrases. And so it is true that young people have all kinds of gifts that they can bring to the community, and they like to have jobs. They like to have meaningful things to do. And I'm not talking about Youth Sunday, which is a lovely thing that happens in a lot of churches where the youth kind of help prepare or lead certain things, one Sunday a month or a couple times a year. That's a good entry point. But I'm talking about real and meaningful, long-term, full participation in leadership and the ministry of the church. And sharing power with them helps them take ownership in the church. So there's one church on the East Coast that I learned about that has liturgy teams. Yeah, that's what they call them, liturgy teams that include families with young children. And so they'll sign up for several families for 1 month at a time. And they get together and they read the scriptures for the month. And then they decide about the hymns and all kinds of liturgy-related things. So that's one really, I think, innovative and beautiful way to invite leadership. I'm also going to just shout out a lot of our smaller churches that just kind of do this by default, because if you have one child who shows up with their grandparent and they ask if they can do something, then you're going to let them do it. Partly because you need the help, and partly because you recognize the gift that they are in the community. So I'm just going to tell the story of Dev the Rev, who was here in the first workshop, Devin Gillespie out in Safford and Morenci, who has an 8-year-old running his tech, basically, for their live stream. Because she said, I want to do that. And he said, okay, here you go. So as I'm talking, what examples of these kinds of relationships and leadership in your own church come up? Because I'm sure that there are examples, there are things already happening in your churches. Yeah?
We had Creation Sunday a few Sundays ago, and one of our youth people came to read, or she played a song that she wrote, and it was awesome. She wrote it herself.
Wonderful. So if you didn't all hear that, she said that for Creation Sunday a couple weeks ago, there was a youth member who came and played a song that she had written and played and sang. Yeah. And what church are you at?
Grace St. Paul's.
Grace St. Paul's. Wonderful. Thank you.
I have an example. Okay, so I was presiding and during the Eucharist, when you break the bread, and I said, Alleluia, Alleluia. I didn't know this till afterwards, but one of our mothers has a 2-year-old, and she was sitting at the back of the church, and she said her 2-year-old went, Lelula, Lelula. But in all honesty, God moves through these children. And I was like, wow, the only one paying attention.
She knew it was good news and she was proclaiming it. That's beautiful. Beautiful.
I was going to say, one of the things that I think also is to have a youth representative on the vestry.
Yes, have a youth representative on the vestry, absolutely. Yeah. And on other committees or guilds or whatever, kind of structures you have in your church. Yeah, thank
And I
you.
know that I'm not commenting on today, but also having something where they don't have to pick between coming to something like this or going to school. That it can be on Saturday, where, like tomorrow, Eucharist, you can have a lot of youth there, who can come and be a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is true, because I received an email about the youth, and I have a 6-year-old granddaughter, and I send the email to her mother to see whether or not she would let her come. And she pondered it, and she decided that, why would they have to come Friday at 1 o'clock when the kids are going to school? So
Yeah.
that's something.
Yeah. Just to clarify, sometimes this happens during fall break. So that's part of what that was. But yes, yeah, to make things accessible if we want them to be involved. Yeah. Okay. So this is a word cloud that I created while I was doing my research for my thesis. And I spoke with 25 people from 4 different congregations, and all of which have been doing intentional work to be age and or ability inclusive. And these are their responses to the question, give me 3 feeling words to describe what it's like to be in your congregation. I like comfy too. So I don't know, does anybody have any reactions to this? Yeah, James.
I'm thinking about the child who said, the 2-year-old who was saying hallelujah. And a lot of Episcopal churches, the worship service that children attend might have no music that's really accessible to a pre-reader or a young child. And so that says something terrible about our idea about what music is and our children's need to have access to it. I think children naturally love to sing and encounter God through song. So if you pick the right song, like Spirit of the Living God, a 4-year-old can learn to sing Spirit of the Living God. If you have just even one song like that in every worship service that children are present, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, so to have a variety of music.
Are going to be present.
Yeah.
To add on to that, I'm a fatal Episcopalian, I'm 47. My memories of being in church when I was little was getting mom's keys out and beating my sister to get in the keys so that I could shake the keys to one of the songs. I remember that at this place in my life. The music is huge for kids to be able to sit out and participate and sing in it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So now am I missing anyone? No, okay. So now we're going to shift to talking about evangelism by young people. So children, as we've already discussed, children, youth, and young adults bring a perspective into the community that is valuable and important for us all to hear. So are we willing to be changed by that perspective? What do you think? I mean, I mentioned earlier that we would talk a little bit about the discomfort that comes with the perspective and the gifts that young people can bring. So a lot of churches see people, so my research was disability and age, so see people with disabilities, and I would say children also, or youth, as a mission rather than persons with gifts with which to serve and lead in the church. And the schooling instructional paradigm that we often kind of adopt for church encourages adults to be with children in ways that assert their power over them, trying to make them be like us or like what we would be. But they are already ministers by virtue of their baptism, as we've already discussed. So John Westerhoff is an Episcopal priest. He wrote this classic. If you've done any reading about Episcopal Christian formation for children, you've probably come across his name. He wrote a book called Will Our Children Have Faith? And he tells a story about teaching a high school class in his church about worship, in which he says the offering is a symbolic communal act in response to the gospel of the people's intentions and commitments for life in the world. And as this class sat with this idea that our offering is a communal act in response to God's good news, the class proposed that in addition to the church's once-a-year contribution toward racial justice, they also place a signed petition for fair housing measures on the altar one Sunday as an offering to God. And the church board discussed it for about a minute and then turned down the proposal. And so the question is, what does this kind of moment or decision do to our capacity to be evangelized by young people? He also asks, Westerhoff, to be a Christian is to ask, what can I bring to another? Not what do I want that person to know or be. It means being open to learn from another person, even a child, as well as to share one's understanding and ways. So I'm just wondering what thoughts or reactions you have to these ideas, because it can be hard to give leadership to other people who aren't like us. That's just honest. So, thoughts, responses, reactions. Oh, yes.
I think part of what you said or you quoted causes me to think that evangelism isn't always necessarily a positive life. Because if you've been exposed to it in a way where it wasn't necessarily delivered in this kind and loving way, but more of an authoritarian, I think you referred to the colonial way of how you indoctrinate other people to believe as you believe. There's quite a bit of difference then in how someone might even perceive what that term means.
Yeah,
as
yeah.
being good or bad.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because we didn't really talk about that earlier when we were talking about what is evangelism, because I grew up thinking it was something very different than what I think it is now. And we didn't kind of deconstruct what that word means to a lot of people, or what we all think of when we hear it in this negative way. So just to your point, as we're talking about evangelism in here, we're talking about how we defined it at the beginning of this workshop, that it is sharing the good news of Jesus Christ in the world. But it's a word that's tricky, so thank you for naming that. So let me ask this a different way. What are problems that we might have with delegating a job you know how to do well to someone else? Yeah.
Well, I would just add that we have to be mindful that we can't set up situations where the goal is to pass on adult wisdom to youth. Because that's kind of how the default of school is set up. It's take it or leave it. Come to this class, pass, and get an A, do whatever. But we're the adults, and you're the kids. And in all of us, the older I get, and the older my kids get, the more aware of how I've done that. Or I know what you don't know, so just shut up and listen. But we do that, we call them programs. And I hope that makes us uncomfortable a little bit, because what we want is anyone to learn how to solve and address their biggest challenges with their own internal set of skills, with their own expressed spirituality. And so that requires us to create conditions where they develop a sense of what is true, what is right, what is wise internally, rather than wait for adults to solve their problems.
Yeah. You know, I'll say I'm partial to Godly Play as a children's formation model. And partly because the main goal of Godly Play is to give children a working knowledge of the Christian language system so that they have this language system to use to make meaning as they move into adolescence and adulthood. And so yeah, I mean, through worship and our conversations and sharing good news together, we're sharing that language, the language of our faith and of our church, so that they have those resources and tools to find their own wisdom and answers. Yeah.
I think also that they're given some leadership, and if they fail, it's a safe place. It's okay to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And you learn from that, and you're still loved, which shows a congregation like a microcosm of God loving us when we fail.
Yeah.
Congregation is still in relationship and loves this family, this child, whatever, however you define fail.
Yeah, because is the point to do church perfectly or to do it all perfectly? Allison and then Kelly.
Along the same lines as allowing them that space to try things out, maybe it succeeds, maybe it doesn't, is to ask questions and not shut them down, to find out, what led them to ask a question. What is it that they're pondering about? Is there something deeper there? And as long as we're not in that mode of, I will give you the answers, you will do what I say. If they ask a question, then we need to be open to that so that might get them to a deeper level of understanding.
Yeah. But questions that are grounded in genuine curiosity and not didactic questions that are trying to lead them to the right answer.
It depends on, even some of the didactic questions. Why do we light the candles in this order?
Oh. Yeah.
They're looking for understanding. They're seeking to understand. And how we answer that is going to either invigorate more questions and lead them to a deeper sense of understanding, or it's just going to answer the question.
Yeah.
So letting them live into that and explore that and open that up to a greater understanding rather than because I told you so.
Right. It's just the way we do it. Yeah.
Just the way we do it. Yeah.
Kelly.
Part of it is in my experience raising my children through the United Church of Christ, we were supported by the entire district, by the entire area, so that we had youth councils that met in southern Arizona, central Arizona, just like our deaneries could have youth councils. We have a very tiny population of youth as members at St. Luke's and Prescott. But gosh, what great things they could do if they got together with Canterbury and the kids in Flagstaff and Clarkdale and other places that would reaffirm not only their ability to lead and develop projects, to develop special things of their own, but also to help build that camaraderie and that sense of the church as a bigger place than that one building I go to on Sunday.
Yeah. I have great news for you.
Good.
I want to hear it. Yeah, well, I'm in the process of forming our first ever Diocesan Youth Leadership Council.
Great.
So stay tuned because I think that's super important too.
Because those kids went out and they did habitat projects, they did things, but they also, the biggest thing was they kept that magic that you have experienced year after year at summer camp alive. Because they could say, oh yeah, I'm going to see these guys at Thanksgiving.
Right.
Oh, and the middle schoolers, they're going to see their friends in March.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and we're going to all see each other in April when we go to Santa Monica to visit the Holocaust Museum. Because they had things that were planned by the youth to do that continued that summer camp experience.
Yeah.
Those hugs, those great times with the friends that you never knew you had.
Yeah.
Over and over again. And those are the things we need to build, especially for us with small populations. I mean, yes, St. Philip's of the Hills can take the entire army out. But
the Lord's Army?
Our group is
Yeah, and there are lots and lots of churches like that, and so I think that what you're saying is true, that we have a great opportunity in bringing youth from lots of churches together. Which actually, there's a youth event this evening, and we have.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
is evangelism, because then they break their friends.
Yeah, you had something to say.
Just a little comment. When I was a teacher in public school in Denver a number of years, then we formed a company that worked with people who had industrial injuries, and we tested them and did all kinds of educational type things. Well, the story is that when I retired, I was bored to death. So I still had a teaching practice, and I went back in the Tempe School District, and I taught kids kindergarten through third grade. And just one thing I wanted to share, and maybe you all will know this. In teaching boys all those years, I found out that they're kind of happy-go-lucky, whatever. But when you try to teach girls, that's a whole different world. They think, they calculate, they ask questions. You better be on the ball, because they don't necessarily take that. So I found there was really a big difference between teaching boys and teaching girls. You have to really listen. And the most important thing that I found out, though, those kids, especially the kindergartners, they want love. From day one, they want love, and they trust you.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's just an observation, but I found it was a lot different to have girls accept what I was saying, and then the boys, okay. But
You know, their children, yes, children behave in a lot of different ways, but they want love, absolutely. Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to move on to talk about evangelism to young people outside of your church. So I'm going to ask you how you find out answers to these questions. Who is your neighbor? Who are the young people who are not in your church but who are around? And what are some ways that you have found this information? And then, what would be good news to them? So this is a time for you to share. How have you found to find out who is your neighbor? And what are their needs? What is good news to them?
I meet my neighbors when I'm out walking the dog.
Walking the dog?
I was going to say that.
Yeah? Great. Yeah, Keely.
Going to the park, the closest playground.
Yeah, yeah.
If you have kids. If not, it can be a little.
Creepy.
It can be easier if you have kids. Yeah. Yeah. Which is another way you're evangelizing together, right? Yes.
We are using a meeting in the park because of COVID. Now the weather's beautiful, but they're still meeting, doing their youth group in the park. And it's been great because that's a nice neutral space, and they're inviting their friends.
Yeah,
So
wonderful.
the good news for some of these kids is just they have something to do and an activity to do.
Yeah,
And it allows us to also share with them.
yeah. So other ways to find who the young people are in your neighborhood who are not already in your church or connected to you somehow. And you could go to school board meetings, town, city council meetings.
The rec center.
The rec center, yeah. And taking a curious and appreciative approach, again, not assuming that you know what people want or need, but listening and asking questions. Reaching out to campus ministries. If you live in one of the cities that has one of our 3 campus ministries, Episcopal campus ministries, wonderful. If you're in a smaller town, there are community colleges everywhere or other institutions. So reaching out because, food insecurity is another thing I didn't mention with issues that young people face. Maybe you could figure out a way to feed a meal to college students or something like give them a place to do laundry. you can support campers by sending money to Chapel Rock Camp and Conference Center, or sending kids from your church to Chapel Rock. I know that one of our churches in a retirement community in southern Arizona, there are, it's a retirement community. There are no kids in the neighborhood, but they send money to support an Episcopal school in Tucson for underprivileged youth. And I think that there's more to that partnership than just sending money. So that open-handed, generous evangelism, I just want to share a story about, we don't want to put any conditions on the good news or whatever it is that we're offering. I mean, I can think of, neighborhood parties thrown for children that I've witnessed before, where they have to come hear a Bible story or a gospel presentation or something before they get the present or the meal. Open-handed, generous, without condition, because that's what the good news is. It doesn't have any conditions. And as we discussed, it is not the point to get them into church. That's not what evangelism is about. But they might show up. It might actually happen. So if they do, what will they experience? And are you ready for change? Because what will they bring? Because if people who show up in the pews are not changing something about what we do and how we are together, then it's probably a sign that our hospitality is inadequate. So people who are truly invited to contribute rather than to assimilate will change things by their very presence. And we need to be open to that and welcome it. So, are you ready?
So, I wasn't here, but you're making me really reflect on a story that's happened in other dioceses, and I've heard a similar story in this diocese relative to what the gentleman over here said, which is, I think that when young people experience God and the opportunity to lead, they want community with people of a variety of ages. They also want community of each other. And when you have a youth leadership community in a diocese, it's beautifully disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes when you have that, somebody who's insecure, could be the clergy person in a local church, could be not Jennifer Ruddle, but it could be in another diocese. I know a new bishop who actually fired an incredible youth minister because the bishop felt insecure, and everyone loved the diocesan youth minister. But that, again, discounted the witness and the reality of that youth community of leaders. They were irrelevant.
Yeah.
So I think that is so important to be open to what people bring to us, that God gives them to bring to us.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know that story, but yes, to be open to the disruptive potential of leadership by young people.
Yes.
Okay, so a few resources that I'm going to tell you about, and then this workshop is going to be posted on YouTube, and there will be a link to this. You can also take a picture of it before you leave if you want, but there will be a link to this sheet of resources on that YouTube video. But Ages and Stages, as I mentioned, there's this book that's really useful for people who are involved in formation, the Episcopal Christian Educator's Handbook. It's got a lot of just skimming the surface content, but it's easy to look up little things if you need to know something. And there are a couple other links that I'll share for that. Hospitality, so Love First, this book I mentioned earlier, has a really nice chapter on our sacred spaces and doing kind of a survey of what do people experience when they go into the room that the children use, the bathroom, where these things are located, things like that. Relationship. So there's a link to an article called Why Every Student Needs Caring Adults in Their Life. And there's also a link to a book called Welcoming and Affirming, a guide to supporting and working with LGBTQ plus Christian youth, which is, again, another really nice resource where you can it's a lot of questions and answers. So I'm not really sure what to do in this situation. And it was written by people who are really knowledgeable, and it's a great resource. Skill building and equipping for ministry. So peer ministry leadership, which I mentioned a couple times. There's a suicide prevention training that's being offered for free through the Episcopal Church Office for Youth Ministries. And so if you would be interested in doing that online training, you can talk to me. It's kind of like suicide prevention first aid. And then there'll be a link to a resource list with all kinds of hotlines on it. And then contributing to organizations that serve young people, Chapel Rock.
Buy popcorn for Boy Scouts.
Okay, all right. We have so little time left, I'm sorry. So this is, I just wanted to share a couple examples of hospitality to young people. These are from a few of our churches. This one is kind of in a church that has transepts. They've kind of designated one of their transepts to be this little chapel area with books, and children can go back and forth between this area and where their families are sitting. This is a folder that one of our churches gives out that has question cards where they can ask a priest a question and fill out things for, listen for this certain thing during the sermon, that kind of thing. And then this is one of our churches on the left that has the first couple pews designated for children, and these are just it's a shelf with some items for children in front of that. So there's some Play-Doh and paper and crayons and some finger labyrinths and some sensory toys. And so these are some things that are pretty simple to implement if your people are ready to be hospitable to disruption. So that's it. And we went longer, so we don't have a lot of time for questions. Oh, it's one of those fancy things that comes slow. Or conversation, but I'm happy to hang out for a little bit if you like. If you're not going to keep your little fidget or whatever you took, put it back in the basket, don't throw it away, or give it to someone else who might play with it or like it. Thank you for being here.